All right, hello everybody. Tonight, this evening, as the sun's setting, we're gonna continue reading Evelyn Underhill's book, Mysticism, The Nature and Development of Spiritual Consciousness. This is from 1910. She's really, really well read in all of these areas, and yet safe. Like, I always want to go to a place that's not out there, like doing hysterical stuff and like trying to engender like giant rapturous feelings in us. And you know, it's just, she's just understanding this for us. She's studying it for us. You know, she spent all this time, and it's an amazing book. It's probably better than you know, most books written in the modern time. No offense to those authors. I always like going back to the source as much as I can, and she keeps quoting from these sources. She had her own translation of, I think, Meister Eckhart's sermons and a lot of other people. All right, I'll face the camera to the sun because it's setting and it's beautiful. Welcome. You can just start right here or go in the playlist and everything. And I appreciate your presence. I appreciate if you take the time to like and comment and share, because it just, for other people who are just looking at the surface of things, it makes it look like, oh, this video is interesting. And so if you are finding benefit from these, I would appreciate if you do that, because it's just giving back. There you go. Now, she influenced Tolkien and JRR Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams. They were part of the Inkling group together. All right. Let's see where the sun is in this. That's the ocean. The Pacific Ocean, if you'd like to know that. I'll give you that. All right, let's enter into the book. We're on mysticism and magic. So she's talking about how people misuse magic, but it's also magic when you're in a church setting and you're going through the same rituals. But I was just listening to St. John of the Cross on part of my walk up here. There's a book called The Ascent to Mount Carmel. Hold on, I don't want this to be hitting my neck. And he's really good about how to go in when you're speaking to God and leave everything behind, and don't get caught up in images and even icons and stuff like that, only that they bring you to God. Yeah, I have to do this, but the tripod doesn't do that right now. It's sort of broke. I don't know what AE lock is. But in spite of the consistent employment, I'm reading the book now. Okay, I'll just read this part. The methods of Brother Hilarion Tissot, there's just kids walking around here, who is described as curing lunacy and crime by the unconscious use of the magnetism of Paracelsus. An intro, but I don't know if I'll use it because then I'll have to edit everything. We're reading Evelyn Underhill's Mysticism book. The sun is about to set over the ocean. Let's begin. I think I'll use it still. something on my phone, and then there's kids around here, so they're making noises. Okay. In spite of the consistent employment by all the great adepts of their occult or supernormal power in the healing and the prevention of disease, on its philosophic side, magic, like Christianity, combines a practical policy of pity for the maimed, halt, and blind, with creed of suffering and renunciation. Here it joins hands with mysticism and proclaims its beliefs in pain as the schoolmaster of every spirit which desires to transcend the life of sense. Eliphas Levi, whilst advising the initiate whose conscious will has reached its full strength to employ his powers in the alleviation of pain and prolongation of life, laughs at the student who seeks in magic a method of escaping suffering, or of satisfying his own selfish desires. None, he says, knows better than the true magician that suffering is of the essence of the world plan. Only those who face it truly live. Only those who face it truly live. C.S. Lewis says pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. It's an indicator that something needs to be attended to, like the fall of man and the fall of the earth. Christ attended to it, but we'll see what she says. Only those who face it truly live. Pain, Alas for the man who will not suffer. He will be crushed by griefs. Again, perhaps his finest utterance, quote, to learn to suffer and to learn to die, this is the gymnastic of eternity, the novitiate of immortal life. That's Eliphas Levi. Here then is the pure theory of magic. It is seen at its best in Eliphas Levi's works, because he was in some respects greater than the system which he preached. Towards the close of his life, the defective and limited nature of that system became clear to him, and in his latest writings he makes no secret of this fact. The chief of these defects is the peculiar temper of mind, the cold intellectual arrogance, the intensely individual point of view which occult studies seem to induce by their conscious quest of exclusive power and knowledge, their implicit neglect of love. At bottom, every student of occultism is striving towards a point at which he may be able to, quote, touch the button and rely on the transcendental world, quote, springing to do the rest. In this hard-earned acquirement of power over the many, he tends to forget the one, with a capital O, And Levi's words, too deep a study of the mysteries of nature may estrange from God the careless investigator, in whom mental fatigue paralyzes the ardors of the heart. When he wrote this sentence, Levi stood, as the greater occultists have often done, at the very frontiers of mysticism. The best of Hermetic philosophers, indeed, are hardly ever without such mystical hankerings, such flashes of illumination, as if the transcendental powers of man, once roused from sleep, cannot wholly ignore the true end for which they were made. In Levi's case, as is well known, the discord between the occult and mystical ideals was resolved by that return to the Catholic Church, which has always amazed and sometimes annoyed his commentators. Wow. Characteristically, he, quote, read into Catholicism much that the Orthodox would hardly allow, so that it became for him, as it were, a romantic gloss on the occult tradition. He held that the Christian Church, nursing mother of the mystics, was also the heir of the Magi, and that popular piety and popular magic veiled the same ineffable truths. He had more justification than at first appears probable for this apparently wild and certainly heretical statement. So she's saying that's certainly heretical. Religion, as we have seen,
can never entirely divorce herself from magic. For her, rituals and sacraments, whatever explanations of their efficacy may be offered by their official apologists, have and must have, if they are to be successful in their appeal to the mind, a magical character. All persons who are naturally drawn towards the ceremonial aspect of religion are really devotees of the higher magic, are acknowledging the strange power of subtle rhythms, symbolic words, and movements over the human will. And, quote, impressive service conforms exactly to the description which I have already quoted of a magical rite. It is, quote, a tremendous forcing house of the latent faculties of man's spiritual nature. Sacraments, too, however simple their beginnings, always tend, as they evolve, to assume upon the phenomenal plane a magical aspect. Those who have observed with understanding, for instance, the Roman rite of baptism, with its spells and exorcisms, its truly hermetic employment of salt, anointing chrism, and ceremonial lights, must have seen in it a ceremony far nearer to the operations of white magic than to the simple lustrations practiced by St. John the Baptist. There are obvious objections to the full working out of this subject in a book which is addressed to readers of all shades of belief. But any student who is interested in this branch of religious psychology may easily discover for himself the numerous and well-marked occult elements in the liturgies of the Christian, or indeed of any other church. There are invocative arrangements of the names of God which appear alike in the Grimoire and in Missal, sacred numbers, ritual actions, perfumes, purifications, words of power, hold as important a place in religion as in magic. In certain minor observances and charm-like prayers, we seem to stand on the very borderland between magician and priest. It does remind me of George MacDonald and how he, one of the ways that C.S. Lewis got pulled into George MacDonald was really reading Lilith and Phantastes. And, I've read At the Back of the North Wind is really good of George MacDonald. They're all online, so you can get them for free. Lewis said there was no one closer to the Holy Spirit of God than what he read in George MacDonald. Quote, magic type of things happening. I love The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and the Cardi. I've read those both here on my YouTube channel. So you can go listen to those. They might look like they're for kids, but they're so profound. They teach you all about how, stay away from the pitfalls in on your spiritual path, and what to look for and how to discern those. They're like fairy tales, but they teach you how to discern and how to trust and how to walk. It's like C.S. Lewis said, every book of his was inspired either directly or indirectly by George MacDonald. And so all of the Narnia books are very similar to what I read in George MacDonald. And Madeleine L'Engle, the woman that wrote A Wrinkle in Time and Many Waters and those, she said the best thing about C.S. Lewis is that he introduced her to George MacDonald. Anyway, if you just want to understand about how magic is put in a good way, it is inevitable that this should be so. The business of the church is to appeal to the whole man. As she finds him living in the world of sense, she would hardly be adequate to this task did she is the church, neglect the powerful weapons which the occult tradition has put into her hand. She knows implicitly that only under these ecstatic conditions, which it is the very object of magic to induce, can normal man open his door upon the infinite and let those subconscious powers, which are the media of all our spiritual experiences, emerge and peep for a moment upon the transcendental world. She who takes the simplest and most common gifts of nature and transmutes them into heavenly food, takes also every discovery which the self has made concerning its own potentialities and turns them to her own high ends. Founding her external system on sacraments and symbols, on rhythmic invocations and ceremonial acts of praise, insisting on the power of the pure and self-denying will and the, quote, magic chain of congregational worship, she does but join hands with those magi whose gold, frankincense, and myrrh were the first gifts that she received. We received them as Christ, as the church, as Mary. The gifts that the magi brought, which were to the Gentiles, they were magicians who studied the stars and knew that the Christ was going to be born. I heard they might have been from the Chaldeans. I talked about it in some of the earlier videos. From the time where Daniel used to be there. Wow, the sun is, this is such a beautiful sunset. I just don't know if you're getting it. Look at that. It looks more like that. I'll let that go for a little bit. But she pays for this. She shares the limitations of the system which her Catholic nature has compelled her to absorb. It is true, of course, that she purges it all of its baser elements, its arrogance, its curiosity. True also that she is bound to adopt it, because it is the highest common measure which she can apply to the spirituality of that world to which she is sent. So we're sent into this world. The word Catholic just means universal. And so it's just like our life is meant to go through a purgation and cleaning. We're not meant to run after our senses. And so, you're not meant to fall in love with the incense and all that. The incense is meant to be a symbol for you to direct your prayers up to God, just like they float up to God. But she cannot, and her great teachers have always known that she cannot extract finality from a method which does not really seek after ultimate things. You must seek first things first. Seek first the kingdom of God. And then all these other things shall be added unto you. But if you seek second things first, like C.S. Lewis things, you won't get first things or second things. Anyway, she'll go on. This method may and does teach men goodness, gives them happiness and health. It can even induce in them a certain exaltation in which they become aware, at any rate for a moment, of the existence of a transcendental world, a stupendous accomplishment. But it will never of itself make them citizens of that world, give to them the freedom of reality with a capital R. The work of the Church in the world, says Patmore, is not to teach the mysteries of life so much as to persuade the soul to that arduous degree of purity at which God himself becomes her teacher. The work of the Church ends when the knowledge of God begins. Thus, in spite of persistent efforts to the contrary, there will always be an inner and an outer church. The inner church of the mystics who know, that's in italicized, the outer church, which operating beneficently is, it's true, but roughly speaking upon the magical plane, only knows about. So they're not knowing. So there's two churches. And some people say that's like St. Peter and St. John. It's like both need each other. And St. Peter was like the rock on which this stands, and John was like the mystic that lived on, and went to Patmos and got the revelation and revealed it to us. And it speaks about Jesus in a different way in his Gospels. But it's a more just experiential way. Some people say it's kind of like when Jesus rose, John got to the tomb first, but Peter walked in. You need both. And there's a whole other passage that I talked about in one of my books, I think in The New Man, where it said when Jesus asked Peter and John to both prepare the upper room, that was a symbolism of this. But I, lead you to make your own conclusions. Don't always check anything that anyone else says. Test the spirits. Look at the sun, it's so beautiful. Wow. It's just shining like that. We'll see these rays. But then I want you to be able to see the sun setting. So the New Testament is not without its reminders that this was bound to be the case. Wow. And she writes the passages. So, see amongst other passages. I'm so glad I looked down at the footnotes. Matthew 13:11, 1 Corinthians 2:6, and 3:1. It's all Roman numerals, so I think that's it. 1 Corinthians 1:6 and 3:1, and Matthew 8:11. So write down those verses if you'd like to in the comments for us so that we can understand. Okay, I never saw this. Well, I don't remember reading this before. Maybe I did a long time ago. Part 2, the mystic way. Chapter 1. Okay, so let me read this quote from Blake. As the pilgrim passes, while the country permanent remains, so men pass on, but the states remain permanent forever. He capitalized states. That's Blake on Jerusalem. As the pilgrim passes, while the country permanent remains, so men pass on, but the states remain permanent forever. I don't know. Okay, now, the sun is setting, but I'm going to do this real quick. You can take a screenshot of this if you'd like. Okay, let's get the sun setting. Chapter 1, introductory. And so I read what she says this chapter is going to be about. Let's pause for the sun setting. I'll get my sweatshirt too. I'm hearing the song. I'm a creep, I'm a weirdo. What the hell am I doing here? I don't belong here. Ah, ah. I want a perfect body, I want a perfect soul. So very special. It's a Radiohead song, but we don't belong here, you know. And it's what are we doing here? But it's because we come from heaven. But it doesn't mean this is hell. That's for sure. All right. Thanks for pausing. That was beautiful. All right. I like having more of the sky. That would be ideal, but I'm on a hill, so we get what we get. We don't throw a fit. Okay. So here's the next section, the mystic way. Chapter 1, introductory. Our object is to describe the normal development of mystic consciousness. Its difficulty. Mystics differ enormously from one another. No one mystic completely typical. A, quote, composite portrait necessary. Its characteristics. The developing mystic consciousness oscillates between pain and pleasure states. Its growth is a continuous transcendence. 5 great stages. First, the one, awakening or conversion. 2, self-knowledge or purgation. 3, illumination. 4, surrender or the dark night. 5, union, distinction between union and ecstasy, unitive life, the goal of the mystic way. annihilation of self, the end of the Oriental mysticism, Christian mysticism denies this interpretation of union, finds in it the enhancement, not the suppression of life. You know, it's like George MacDonald has a beautiful sermon called The White Stone. It's in his Unspoken Sermons. Like, I look so scary right there, but the sun, the horizon is so beautiful. But look, no, I don't look scary because the sun, it's the golden hour, you know. I put all my sweatshirts on. I've got to, because it's getting cold. It's winter here in California. Anyway, the White Stone, and so he talks about, it's kind of like when you have, it's in the book of Revelation, when you have union with God. I don't know if I told you guys that I've been studying psychology for 30 years now. I've been a psychologist for over 20, and I went to school for 9 years before that. So I'm a doctor in my day job, you know, and so I'm not just trying to speak just to hear my voice, because I'd rather just keep reading her personally. But if I can help people understand, so let me know if this helps you, how I'm describing these things because I was just listening I was listening to the book The Power of Now of Eckhart Tolle, and he said, this is why Jesus said, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. He's like, you can only know this experientially. And so I'm giving you it in experiences so you can understand when you come across the knowing in your own experience. Anyway, so it's not just book learning, but George MacDonald talks about the white stone, and that God gives each of us in the book of Revelation a white stone, you know, if we get to go to where he's talking about, you know. And on that stone is your personal name, your God name, and only you and God know that, and only you have that. And so it's like you are an aspect of God that only you are. And so God longs for you, just like you long for God, you know. Rumi said that, what you're seeking is seeking you. Anyway, it's so beautiful. And so it's separate from what the Buddhists say. Like there's a lot of things in common about, you know, an awake soul and an asleep soul and a soul that's giving to other people, and then a soul that goes into union, but you don't lose yourself. But it feels like you're facing death. But Jesus faced death, you know, and he trusted that he would rise again, that he would rise himself again, and he did. And so he showed us that not to be afraid of death. Okay. So she says that these are, I can't wait for her to talk about these stages, because I've been through all of these, and I mean, I'm not in like union yet with divine, as far as I know. I hope I am to some degree, but I don't think they're always linear like this. I'm sure she'll talk about this. So she said, the awakening or conversion, self-knowledge is 2, or purgation. 3, illumination. 4, surrender, or the dark night, like the dark night of the soul. 5, union, distinction between union and ecstasy. And then I'm going to go ahead a little bit to where I was. Christian mysticism denies this interpretation of union, finds in it the enhancement, not the suppression of life, the divine dark, the true unitive life, active, a state of divine fecundity, the great actives, their dual character of action and fruition. Saint Catherine of Siena, the proper end of the mystic way is deification. We are not now to turn from general principles and study those principles in action to describe the psychological process or mystic way. Not now, we are now. All right, so we are now to turn from general principles and study those principles in action to describe the psychological process or mystic way by which that peculiar type of personality, which is able to set up direct relations with the absolute, is usually developed. That bird was cool. Again, I wish you guys could all be here with me. It's so... I mean, there's people around that are here for the sunset because this is sort of like a tourist. It can be a tourist area, but I'd come down below where they are. But the water, look at the ocean. It's just so still right now. Okay. By which that peculiar type of personality which is able to set up direct relations with the absolute is usually developed. The difficulty of this description will lie in the fact that all mystics differ one from another, as all the individual objects of our perception, living and not living, do. The creative impulse in the world, so far as we are aware of it, appears upon ultimate analysis to be free and original, not bound and mechanical, to express itself in defiance of the determinists with a certain artistic spontaneity. Man, when he picks out some point of likeness as a basis on which to arrange its production in groups, is not discovering its methods, but merely making for his own convenience an arbitrary choice of one or two, not necessarily characteristic qualities, which happen to appear in a certain number of different persons or things. Hence, the most scientific classification is a rough and ready business at best. When we come to apply such a classification to so delicate and elusive a series of psychological states as those which accompany the contemplative life, all the usual difficulties seem to be enormously increased. You can say a prayer. I'm just saying a prayer that everyone here will get what God wants them to get out of this video, you know. Even if it's just the sunset or the horizon or, you know, one of these bushes or whatever, it doesn't have to be all that I'm reading, you know. It could be something in between my words. The silence in between. Okay, when we come to apply such a classification to so delicate and elusive a series of psychological states as those to which accompany the contemplative life, all the usual difficulties seem to be enormously increased. No one mystic can be discovered in whom all the observed characteristics of the transcendental consciousness are resumed, and who can on that account be treated as typical. Mental states which are distinct and mutually exclusive in one case exist simultaneously in another. In some stages which have been regarded as essential are entirely omitted. In others their order appears to be reversed. Oh, like I said, they don't go in like a linear order. And I'm being reminded when I spoke to the Jesuit priest who was my director at a silent retreat house I went to. He said we're all called to be mystics. We are all mystics because we're spirit. We're made out of spirit. We have a body, but we're spirit, you know. And Jesus said there will be a time when true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. We seem at first to be confronted by a group of selves which arrive at the same end without obeying any general law. Take, however, a number of such definitely mystical selves and make of them, so to speak, a composite portrait, as anthropologists do when they wish to discover the character of a race. From this portrait we may expect a type to emerge, in which all the outstanding characteristics contributed by the individual examples are present together and minor variations are suppressed. Such a portrait will of course be conventional, but it will be useful as a standard which can be constantly compared with and corrected by isolated specimens. Because when we go off on our own and we're not following the Holy Scriptures, that's when we run into heresies, you know. But people can use Scriptures in the wrong way to try to bind you in boxes. And Jesus wasn't bound by some. He said, Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? Those who do the will of God. You know, he made all of us equal in that statement. all of us equal in Christ. There's not the distinction anymore, what I saw. But the first thing we notice about this composite portrait is that the typical mystic seems to move towards his goal through a series of strongly marked oscillations between, quote, states of pleasure and states of pain. The existence and the succession of these states, sometimes broken and confused, sometimes crisply defined, can be traced to a greater or less degree in almost every case of which we possess anything like a detailed record. Gyrundi, vadet spiritus. I don't know what she's saying in Latin, so Gyransgrando. Grando, vadit spiritus. I think that's Latin. Vadit. And then I know that last word is spirit. The soul, as it treads the ascending spiral of its roads towards reality, experiences alternately the sunshine and the shade. These experiences are constants of the transcendental life. The spiritual states of the soul are all eternal, said Blake, with the true mystical genius for psychology. The spiritual states of the soul are all eternal, said Blake, with the true mystical genius for psychology. So that's, anyway, that's in the book Jerusalem. Oftentimes the Beatles were singing about mystic things, and so when she was saying that, the alternating between sunshine and shade, I was thinking of, here comes the sun, da 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 da, I say it's all right, every little thing is going to be all right, is what Bob Marley says. And it's the same, because Bob Marley was a mystic, and the Beatles were trying to be. I know that there are a lot of mystic teachings in their songs. I get them all the time. But also, Julian of Norwich, she said that she was shown, in her vision, in the end, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And Jesus, when he rose from the dead, and he came to the disciples in the locked room, and he said, peace be with you, and he breathed on them. He's showing that by his actions, by his words and his actions, and by raising from the dead. That's showing all shall be well. Like, victory is won over death. It's just who will enter into this victory with us, All are invited, everyone. And I don't know what it means at the end. All knees shall bow and tongue confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, and I will draw all men up unto myself. That's men and women. Okay, they're doing photographs up above, and she's giving them the instructions. Walk towards me, shine. It's fine. It's fine. Good job. It's a good time to take pictures. Such a portrait. It's so funny. We're talking about portraits. Okay. The complete series of these states, and it must not be forgotten that few individuals present them all in perfection, while in many instances several are blurred or appear to be completely suppressed, will be, I think, most conveniently arranged under 5 heads. Great. This method of grouping means, of course, the abandonment of the time-honored threefold division of the mystic way, and the apparent neglect of St. Teresa's equally celebrated 7 degrees of contemplation. But I think that we shall gain more than we lose by adopting it. Okay, this 5 heads, okay. The groups, however, must be looked upon throughout as diagrammatic, and only as answering loosely and generally to experiences which seldom present themselves in so rigid and unmixed a form. These experiences, largely conditioned as they are by surroundings and by temperament, exhibit all the variety and spontaneity which are characteristic of life in its highest manifestations. And like biological specimens, they lose something of their essential reality in being prepared for scientific investigation. Okay, and so I love there's this Catholic priest called Father Gallagher. Oh, look at that. And he's so good about this. He's like, when you enter this, he's about to read a passage from a mystic. He's like, enter this with deep reverence. This person spent their whole life to get to these revelations, not to chase after revelations from God, but that they came in a sweet moment as a gift from God, and God wanted them to write it down. But you have no idea the depth at which, they're speaking them. And anyway, just enter into the tenderness, even of these videos. These are hard. He called them. He didn't, but this guy that reminds me much of him, the one that who's also studied in the exercises of Saint Ignatius, Saint Timothy Gallagher is this guy's name, and he has all these books on the exercises of Saint Ignatius. But someone who's studied him and knows of him and was also a priest in this way, said to me, Cheryl, there are hard-won graces and easy graces. There are graces that come to us readily because God's ready to give them to us. And there are ones that come from sleepless nights and purgations of your soul and crying and loneliness and confusion. God's not the God of confusion, but we get confused because we're pilgrims and we don't know which way to go, and God lets us go blind for a little bit, but he's always there, And so some of these videos are hard-won graces, and some of them come easy. All right. I don't know if I can turn around. Let's see. Oh. It was raining, so the ground's pretty wet. Okay. So he's saying, that's what I was saying Timothy Gallagher talks about, is like when you're reading this and we're breaking it down into stratagems and categories, you don't realize the sweetness that was in there. And sometimes it's kind of like if I break down songs, I don't want to lose the sweetness of the song, So essentially reality, essential reality, their essence, the essence is God, in being prepared for scientific investigation. Taken all together, they constitute one continuous process of transcendence, the movement of consciousness from lower to higher levels of reality, the steady remaking of character in accordance with the, quote, independent spiritual worlds. Okay. I was just thinking, if I hadn't gone through all the hard-won graces, I wouldn't get here to this day, So it's all hard-won. But I'm sure your life is the same. So I just want you to know you're not alone, and persevere. And look, we get sunsets like this and books like this. So, okay, I'll read this again. Taken all together, they constitute one continuous process of transcendence, the movement of consciousness from lower to higher levels of reality, the steady remaking of character in accordance with the, quote, independent spiritual world. But as the study of physical life is made easier for us by an artificial division into infancy, adolescence, maturity, and old age, so a discreet indulgence of the human passion for map-making will materially increase our chances of understanding the nature of the mystic way. Here, then, is the somewhat arbitrary classification under which we shall study the phases of the mystical life. 1. The awakening of the self to consciousness of divine reality, with a capital D-R, This experience, usually abrupt and well-marked, is accompanied by intense feelings of joy and exaltation. 2. The self-aware, for the first time, of divine beauty, realizes by contrast its own finiteness and imperfection, the manifold illusions in which it is immersed, the immense distance which separates it from the one, one God, its attempts to eliminate by discipline and mortification all that stands in the way of its progress towards union with God, constitute purgation, a state of pain and effort. I'm going to say something about that right now because I always trust what's coming to me on my path before I get to read this to you, is today I was taking someone I love that may be young to a doctor's appointment. I won't go into that because I just keep privacy, but it's not pretty. Anyway, but we were listening to The Voyage of the Dawn Treader on the way back, right? And in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is Lucy and Edmund and Prince Caspian, and they're on a boat, and their cousin Eustace is there, Lucy and Edmund's, and they don't like him, Edmund was the jerk before. This guy is, like a wet blanket. And they get to an island, and I won't tell all of it because that's C.S. Lewis's story, but he drinks of this water because he's thirsty, because he snuck off, though. He was already in the wrong place. And he turns into a dragon, and he goes on and it goes on, and he doesn't know, and if he's going to be undragoned or whatever, and they have to go on the boat on their journey, and he finally is like, just leave me here, even though I'm so lonely as a dragon. I have to stay here so you guys can go on the journey. But in the last moment, Aslan comes to him in what seems like a dream and says, follow me, and he does, because he's pretty desperate, And and he comes to this pool, and he's this clear pool, and he's like, oh, I bet my arm would stop hurting, because he put this gold thing on his arm when he was a boy, but when he turned into a dragon, that gold hurt him. The things we take when we think we can, and we ought not to. And so Aslan says to him, you must undress before you go into that water. You can't go in there like that. And so he's like, undress? What does that mean? I have no clothes on. I'm a dragon, And then he remembers, like snakes shed their skin, and he is itching and sheds one skin, and he feels so good that he took off this thick layer. And he goes to go in the pool, and he looks down, and he still is a dragon. And so he does it again, and he itches, and there's another layer, and he walks out of it and leaves it there. And he looks again, and he does it again, right? And so he does it 3 times, of course, because our effort is important. And then Aslan says, you must let me undress you. And so he says he's desperate, so he lets him, and he lays down, and he said his claw went in there, because Aslan's a lion, and it went to his heart, and it felt like he was going to die. It was like the worst pain he'd ever experienced in his life, he said. But he felt like so amazing. And then Aslan picked him up and threw him in the water, however the lion can, like a cat, when he was in the water for a while, and so glad to be back to his puny self, And then Aslan says, you must let me clothe you. And so Aslan, it's just like God, provides us with the new clothing, You must be born of water and of the Spirit, be born anew, born again. And so we try to de-dragon ourselves, But God will do it best, and trust that God will lead you. He led you to this. It's amazing that you got to this video. My channel is not well known right now. At this moment, it is not well known at all, But even if it becomes well known in the future, it's a miracle, I think, that this video came to you. And so trust that it did, All right, that's all I wanted to say. And you can pray that I make it home and I don't get eaten by coyotes. You'll know because this video got posted, but it is getting dark, so I don't ever want to test the Lord, and see. I mean, I'm sure I'll be okay. The coyotes are little, but there's bobcats and mountain lions and stuff, but they don't usually come on the main path. And usually there's bikers that go past me. And I can call someone if I have to. And I can Uber if I had to. I'm by a town right here. Anyway, I'll see. I'll be quiet after this and see what I ought to do. Okay, so this purgation So, towards union with God constitutes purgation, a state of pain and effort. 3. When, by purgation of the self, has become detached from the, quote, things of sense, and acquired the ornaments of the spiritual marriage, its joyful consciousness of the transcendent order returns in an enhanced form. Like the prisoners in Plato's cave of illusion, it has awakened to knowledge of reality with a capital R, has struggled up the harsh and difficult path to the mouth of the cave. Now it looks upon the sun, which is illumination, a state which includes in itself many of the stages of contemplation, degrees of orison, visions and adventures of the soul described by Saint Teresa of Avila, and other mystical writers. These form, as it were, a way within the way, a moyen de parvenir. I don't know if that's French. MOYENDEPARVENIR, a training devised by experts which will strengthen and assist the mounting soul. They stand, so to speak, for education, whilst the way proper represents organic growth. Illumination is the, quote, contemplative state par excellence. It forms with the two preceding states the, quote, first mystic life, end quote. Many mystics never go beyond it, and on the other hand, many seers and artists, not usually classed amongst them, have tested to some extent the splendors of the illuminated state. It entails a vision of the absolute, a sense of the divine presence, but not true union with it. It is a state of happiness. Oh, my friend was this musician, Elliott Smith, and he sang a song, and he was like, oh, what I used to be will pass away, and then you'll see that all I want now is happiness for you and me. I don't remember if he wrote that song before I gave him Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy that was written in like 480 AD, 480 or so. I gave him that book. We talked, but it was about true happiness, not passing happiness, true happiness. That you get when you're in a state of union with God, or in your beingness, in your essence, in your soul self, your spirit. Anyway, but not true union with it. It is a state of happiness. In the development of the great and strenuous seekers after God, this is followed, or sometimes, that was Elliott Smith, just so if you want to look up that song. In the development of the great and strenuous seekers after God, this is followed, or sometimes intermittently accompanied, by the most terrible of all the experiences of the mystic way, the last and most complete purification of the self, which is called by some contemplatives the mystic pain or mystic death, by others the dark night of the soul. The consciousness which had, in illumination, sunned itself in the sense of the divine presence, now suffers under an equally intense sense of the divine absence, learning to dissociate the personal satisfaction of mystical vision from the reality of mystical life. You don't keep getting to be in the sun and having mystic visions all the time, because like God doesn't want you to be on coke. I'll just say I'll leave it like talking about the soda, but he doesn't want you high. He wants you cleaned, purgation, to let go of depending on your senses, because then you make them your idols, and you don't go towards God more. You have to go into the dark, as it were, to get to God. Anyway, she'll talk about it, I'm sure. As in purgation, the senses were cleansed and humbled, and the energies and interests of the self were concentrated upon transcendental things. So now the purifying process is extended to the very center of I-hood, the will. The human instinct for personal happiness must be killed. This is the, quote, spiritual crucifixion so often described by the mystics, the great desolation in which the soul seems abandoned by the divine. The self now surrenders itself, its individuality, and its will completely. It desires nothing, asks nothing, is utterly passive, and is thus prepared for 5. Union. Step 5, union. The true goal of the mystic quest. In this state, the absolute life is not merely perceived and enjoyed by the self as an illumination, but is one with it. This is the end towards which all of the previous oscillations of consciousness have tended. It is a state of equilibrium, of purely spiritual life, characterized by peaceful joy, by enhanced powers, by intense certitude. To call this state, as some authorities do, by the name of ecstasy is inaccurate and confusing, since the term ecstasy has long been used both by psychologists and ascetic writers to define that short and rapturous trance, a state with well-marked physical and psychical accompaniments, in which the contemplative, losing all consciousness of the phenomenal world, is caught up to a brief and immediate enjoyment of the divine vision. Ecstasies of this kind are often experienced by the mystic in illumination, or even on his first conversion. They cannot therefore be regarded as exclusively characteristic of the unitive way. In some, indeed St. Teresa is an example, the ecstatic trance seems to diminish rather than increase in frequency after the state of union has been attained. Union must be looked upon as the true end of mystical education, the permanent condition of life upon transcendent levels of reality, of which ecstasies give a foretaste to the soul. Intense forms of it, described by individual mystics under symbols such as those of mystical marriage, deification, or divine fecundity, all prove on examination to be aspects of this same experience, quote, seen through a temperament. It is right, however, to state here that the Oriental mysticism insists upon a further stage beyond that of union, which stage regards as the real goal of the spiritual life. It regards as the real spiritual goal of life. Is the real goal of the spiritual life. This is the total annihilation or reabsorption of the individual soul in the infinite. Such an annihilation is said by the Sufis to constitute the, quote, 8th stage of progress, in which alone they truly attain to God. Thus stated, it appears to differ little from the Buddhist nirvana, and is the logical corollary of that pantheism to which the Oriental mystic always tends. It is at least doubtful, however, whether the interpretation which has been put upon it by European students be correct. The passage in which Al-Ghazali attempts to describe it is certainly more applicable to the unitive life as understood by Christian contemplatives than to the Buddhistic annihilation of personality. Quote, the end of Sufism, he says, is total absorption in God. This is at least the relative end to that part of their doctrine which I am free to reveal and describe, but in reality it is but the beginning of the Sufi life. For those intuitions and other things which precede it are, so to speak, but the porch by which they enter. In this state, some have imagined themselves to be amalgamated with God, others to be identical with Him, others again to be associated with Him, but all this is sin. Wow. Okay. The doctrines of annihilation as the end of the soul's ascent, whatever the truth may be as to the Muslim attitude concerning it, is decisively rejected by all European mystics, though a belief in it is constantly imputed to them by their enemies, for their aim is not the suppression of life, but its intensification, a change in its form. This change, they say, in a paradox, which is generally misunderstood, consists in the perfecting of personality by the utter surrender of self. It is true that the more orientally minded amongst them, such as Dionysius the Areopagite, do use language of a negative kind, which seems almost to involve a belief in the annihilation rather than the transformation of the self in God. But this is because they are trying to describe a condition of supersensible vitality from the point of view of the normal consciousness, to which it can only seem a nothing, a dark, a self-loss. Further, it will be found that this temperamental language is generally an attempt to describe the conditions of transitory perception, not those of permanent existence. The characteristic, that is to say, of the ecstatic trance, in which for a short time the whole self is lifted to transcendent levels, and the absolute is apprehended by a total suspension of the surface consciousness. Hence the divine dark, the nothing, is not a state of non-being to which the mystic aspires to attain. It is rather an approximate and imperfect name for his consciousness of that undifferentiated Godhead, that supernal light, whence he may, in his ecstasies, bring down fire from heaven to light the world. Wow, look at this. I hope you're getting this. It's all red, like, it's more like that. I didn't look up because I was looking down at the book. I'm going to read one more paragraph, it looks like. In the mystics of the West, the highest form of divine union impel the self to some sort of active rather than of passive life. This is now recognized by the best authorities as the true distinction between Christian and non-Christian mysticism. The, quote, Christian mystics, says Delacroix, move from the infinite to the definite. They aspire to infinitize life and to define infinity. They go from the conscious to the subconscious and from the subconscious to the conscious. The obstacle in their path is not consciousness in general, but self-consciousness, the consciousness of the ego. The ego is the limitation, that which opposes itself to the infinite. The states of consciousness free from self, lost in a vaster consciousness, may become modes of the infinite and states of the divine consciousness. So, Starbuck, for the coffee place, he says, quote, the individual learns to transfer himself from a center of self-activity into an organ of revelation of universal being, and to live a life of affection for and oneness with the larger life outside. All right. What was I going to say about that? Oh, I was, because we're looking at the ocean. That's what I was thinking of, is that some people say it's like we are one drop out of the ocean. We can't say I am the ocean. But if you bring that drop back into the ocean, right, then it feels like it is the ocean. You are experiencing yourself as the ocean. So you have this isness, this essence of God. God is the absolute infinite beingness, you know, and so I heard a mystic say that, you know, if you talk to the angels and you ask them, who are you? They'd say, I am God, because, you know, the good angels, they are surrendered to God and live to do God's will. And so they're one with God so much, and they never separated like us, you know. And so they don't know anything but that. So they're like part of Godness, you know. I wish you so much love. Thank you so much for being here. Please like again and share and comment. I just think that I'm meant to ask that, not because I care, because I had to stop caring because it wasn't happening for 3 years. That's my purgation. Let me just share that. All right. I wish you so much love. Much love.